Hello, my name's Lucy Catt, and I'm going to be giving you an overview of Gavin and Doherty's review of data needs for the offshore renewable energy sector, which was undertaken for the INFOMAR programme. So we've gone through a number of sections in our review. First of all, we looked at the near-term and long-term ORE sector data needs, and then we looked at a geophysical and geotechnical data gap analysis between INFOMAR's deliverables and those needs. We then looked at how that gap can be bridged, both by INFOMAR, but also by industry and the use of complementary information. We then considered the INFOMAR data value to the ORE sector and some industry engagement recommendations. So for near-term ORE sector needs, this is driven a lot by the condition of the market, and this takes us up to 2030. So currently the ORE sector in Ireland operates as a developer-led or centralised model. And this means developers are responsible for everything from site identification through to building, operating and decommissioning. So to achieve Ireland's target of 5 gigawatts by 2030, this is going to require a robust consenting regime, a subsidy support scheme and the facilitation of grid connections to enable developers to meet those targets. The framework underpinning this is defined in the draft National Marine Planning Framework, which was published in November 2019 and expected to be finalised shortly. It includes provision of statutory development management guidelines for the marine area and a set of offshore wind specific guidelines. So the Renewable Energy Electricity Support Scheme and the Grid Connection Policy, the Enduring Connection Policy, are both now in operation, and offshore specific RES auctions will be held going forward. And the first major reform of marine consenting is currently being legislated for through the Maritime Area Planning Bill, which is a high priority, and efficient passage through the Houses is expected following introduction in Q2 2021. So we can drill down into consenting needs and stakeholder requirements, which essentially are what defines when you need your data at what stage of your project. Whatever the regime, we know we're going to need high quality data to satisfy environmental legislation, i.e. to undertake environmental impact assessments, and so developers can bid into RES auctions with a high price certainty, i.e. having a full understanding of the amount of energy their site can generate, which means they need to understand the geology, the wind conditions, the ocean conditions, etc. Multiple rounds of RES auctions are going to be held. The earliest projects being developed in Ireland, Arklow and the relevant projects, will likely target the first auction, RES 1, whereas new projects will target 2 and 3. So the first major milestone for those developers is getting a foreshore licence for early stage site investigations. However, at this point, the site is not exclusive to those developers. The first major consenting milestone is going to be obtaining a conditional maritime area consent, which is where you get site exclusivity. And we can see some timelines here for relevant projects and new projects. And the total length of those schedules is different. But early on, you can see we need to complete both the EIA and the RES award in order to get to the more detailed design phases. So what controls the data we need for the design phases for the wind farm? That's going to rely on the current foundation technologies for the near term. And in the near term, we're looking primarily at fixed wind solutions, so driven monopiles, but also driven pile jackets and gravity-based foundations. Monopiles are by far dominating the market, and the East Coast is most favourable for those projects, which is why that's where most of the projects are currently concentrated. To understand the site capacity and suitability, we need to think about water depths, depths to bedrock, geological conditions, and the seabed and subseabed hazards. We also need to think about other factors such as seabed stability, mobility, and scour potential. On the right, we can see broadly a summary of the different foundation types. What comes out of that is essentially to understand that for monopiles and jackets, especially in deeper water, regularly you will need investigation depths to understand the geology and the seabed of more than 50 metres below seabed. Whereas for cables, the depth of interest is typically less than 10 metres below seabed, but you do need very high resolution in those areas. So near term, in summary, we're primarily looking at fixed wind, primarily monopiles, in water depths of less than 70 metres. The depth of site characterisation is going to be up to 100 metres below seabed to inform foundation development stages. And the highest resolution data is going to be needed in the top 5 to 10 metres to inform environmental impact assessments and cable routing. The typical data, geophysical and geotechnical data that's going to be required, bathymetry, side scan sonar, magnetometer, magnetic radiometer, shallow seismic, medium penetration seismic, in the foundation depth range, and of course targeted geotechnical data and lab testing. But you don't necessarily need all the data at the beginning of the project. And we can look at the project development timeline and say, when do we need these data? What resolution? What coverage? And early on, when looking at site viability and thinking about early stage foundation optioneering, we can get away with very high level information. So bathymetry data doesn't necessarily need to be current or down to 0.5 meter resolution. You need indicative depth to bedrock and geotechnical parameters, but you don't need detailed mapping across the site. We will need more up-to-date seabed information for the environmental impact assessment, which is also required to successfully get through auction. Once we pass through auction, this is where we start needing more current and more detailed data to undertake front-end engineering design, FEED, which includes layout optimization and selection of cable routes. And then after the final investment decision, this is when the most detailed investigations take place with the most current data, very targeted on individual foundation locations. In the long term, we need to think about how the market environment will change. So there are strong indications that there's going to be a move to a much more centralized renewable energy model. So instead of developers taking projects through from start to finish, the state will take control of selecting sites and potentially also collecting data, storing data and distributing data, maybe even managing assets. So for long-term projects, this means that focus is likely to shift to foundation concepts that can take advantage of areas not congested by fixed foundation projects, which is going to mean the south coast, the west coast, and deeper water areas of the east coast. And in those areas, we're looking primarily at floating wind concepts, which are well suited to deeper water areas, although certainly some fixed solution projects will continue in areas of deeper water. So floating wind, there are different types of wind platform, but the key thing from a G&G data perspective and an investigation of the subsurface is the type of mooring and the type of anchor. And anchors can vary from drag anchors or suction piles, driven piles. The key difference compared to near-term needs is floating foundations will be in deeper waters, but will be taken to shallower depths below seabed. So we'll still have a similar staged investigation process, but the depths of interest and the environments for those investigations will change, although it's anticipated that cabling considerations will remain largely the same. The other impact we need to think about in terms of the sector data needs is about data delivery. So if we move to a plan-led model or to a centralized model, this means it's going to change who's responsible for collecting data, processing and interpreting those data, and storing and distributing those data. In a centralized system, there's going to be a need for a full-time role at the state body for organising and managing activities pre-development, including data collection. And the state body will need capacity to store, catalogue and distribute these data. And also, there's probably going to be a need for defined data standards where data is being collected on behalf of the state. So we can take those near-term and long-term needs and think about the suitability of the G&G data that INFOMAR currently provide. And the INFOMAR programme was designed primarily for seabed mapping. So all the additional data we get, the seismic data, is essentially data of opportunity. And it's an incredibly valuable resource. When we look at the ORE sector data needs, we can see that from the INFOMAR programme, we have really valuable information on water depths, which is one of the key things we need to determine foundation suitability. And we also have really good information on geology or depth of bedrock within the top 10 metres because of all the shallow seismic data that INFOMAR collect. We have enough information to consider seabed mobility, environmental baseline data, although this is partly dependent on the coverage and the age of the data, ecological data, obstructions and infrastructure mapping. Where we have the biggest gaps are the deeper you go, the less likely you are to get information from INFOMAR seismic, because primarily we're using shallow penetration systems, which have a limit of maybe 25 to 30 metres. There's also some single channel seismic, which gives us a little more depth extension, but the distribution is much less compared to the single channel shallow seismic. And below about 50 metres below seabed, INFOMAR seismic data doesn't really cover that range. And we don't have any geotechnical information other than very shallow grabs and cores. And obviously knowing that geotechnical information is key for thinking about foundation options. So how do we bridge the gap? Well, we can look at what the INFOMAR programme could do. And these recommendations are driven by the ORE sector. That doesn't mean they all necessarily need to be implemented. It will depend on which ones are judged to be most cost effective. And certainly, INFOMAR have a very user-friendly portal in place for which minor adjustments could really increase the usability. For example, using a systematic line and file naming convention and using sensor-specific track plots. For data formats, hydrographic data are provided in standard formats, but it would be also good to do the same thing for seismic and geotechnical data, where we recommend SEGY and AGS formats respectively. For data delivery, the portal is already sufficient for near-term development needs, as has been demonstrated on many projects. In the long term, should we move to a more centralised model, it's a very attractive option to develop that portal further rather than starting from scratch, but this will have impacts on stored data volumes and site traffic. So for survey scopes and data collection, there are several recommendations in the report, not all of which necessarily need to be taken up. It will depend on which is judged to be most cost effective. The key ones we have thought about are transition from WGS 84 to ETRS 89 for serving data, because ETRS 89 coordinate system is fixed to the European plate. There's also the potential to use unmanned survey vehicles to increase coverage with shallow seismic, bathymetry and backscatter without taking up valuable ship time. For single channel data that's currently acquired, so PINGA, CHIRP and INFOMAR, it would be valuable potentially to increase the weighting of data quality against acquisition efficiency. For single channel Sparker, the system that INFOMAR already deploy is very useful, and we'd recommend targeted acquisition where bedrock is more than 25 meters depth, which will be more efficient than a broad campaign. And for magnetometer surveying, currently magnetometer surveying by INFOMAR is carried out with a constant toe depth, and we would recommend a constant altitude, which will be more useful for infrastructure mapping. And for seabed sampling, there's a great resource of seabed samples, grab samples, drop cores, etc. But the distribution is variable, so we'd recommend a targeted gap filling approach using existing seabed classification maps that INFOMAR have produced. And there's also potential for additional types of data collection. So acoustic Doppler current profilers to look at current velocities and turbulence, which is really important for calculating loads on marine structures. Multi-channel seismic, which is going to be most useful where bedrock is deep and water is shallow, and multi-channel seismic is required to get the investigation depth needed for foundations. In terms of geotechnical data, as we've identified, there's a large gap in terms of geotechnical information, and potentially this could be partially resolved by undertaking a targeted CPT campaign, so cone penetrometer testing, off the East Coast and bays near Galway and Donegal, which are most suitable areas for this kind of testing. And also, if possible, collection of boreholes, again, targeted on areas of greatest uncertainty. In order to help projects pass through environmental impact assessment, it would also be really valuable to do biological sample collection when undertaking grabs, and to undertake image and video collection as routine for flora and fauna identification. So in terms of geographic areas, there's also value in undertaking repeat bathymetry surveys to investigate seabed mobility. This targeted single channel Sparker data collection and multi-channel data collection, and also CPT campaign. So what complementary information is out there that we can use to build upon the INFOMAR database that already exists? There's open access information, so obviously publications and research, and eModNet. eModNet serves data collected by INFOMAR, but also other information such as coastal retreat data. And of course, maps and memoirs from the BGS and the Geological Survey Ireland. There's also commercial data out there, and a non-obvious source, but one that could be quite useful, is other offshore renewable energy developers. So if a developer drops out of a project, an arrangement could be made to share data they've collected to date. And as we move into a more centralised model, there's potential for legacy project data to be passed on to the state and then served back out again if a site comes back into contention, for example, using a different foundation technology. There are lots of pipelines and cables out there, all of which will have had pre and post installation surveys. And for pipelines, certainly, there'll be annual inspection reports, which can be very useful for considering cabling conditions. And also oil and gas data. There's a huge archive of 2D and 3D seismic data shown in the map on the right, which is taken from the Petroleum Affairs Division. And archive data are of limited use without reprocessing. And the usefulness is very much dependent on the acquisition settings, the formats and the age of the data, which means it's going to be very much a site-specific and dataset-specific assessment to see if these data could be useful. Due to the geographic distribution and the fact these data are slightly more limited in use close to the seabed, this is going to be most useful for sites looking to develop deep foundations in deeper waters. So, bridging the gap, industry responsibilities. Developers will need to undertake seismic data processing, interpretation and ground modelling to make the most of INFOMAR data. And it's necessary that at an early stage of the desk study phase, it is established what data are available from INFOMAR and if the depth coverage and the spatial coverage are enough to understand the site geology. If it's not, you'll need to undertake more survey. This may mean more geophysical survey if the depth of interest needs to be extended. More geophysical survey will be required post-auction. Geotechnical surveying will almost certainly be required pre-auction to get some geotechnical information to quantify the geophysical interpretation and will be required for feed activities. And the geophysical survey should be used to target the geotechnical campaigns. You'll also need to make sure you've got sufficient environmental impact assessment data. So to summarise the value of INFOMAR data to the ORE sector, for near-term developments, it's in the pre-auction phase to assess site viability and foundation optioneering for sites where bedrock is less than 25 metres below seabed, to understand cable route geology, and to reduce the scope and the cost of pre-auction G&G surveys. It has greater value in the cable route areas due to the shallow depth of interest compared to foundation areas, and the availability of baseline INFOMAR data for specific areas is highly valuable and may negate the need for environmental baseline survey at an initial stage. In the long term, for floating wind, this value is still in the pre-auction stages primarily, and may be greater in the turbine areas due to the shallower foundation depth of interest. And long term, the value of the project and its legacy may be to use the existing programme infrastructure to build on for a more centralised data strategy post-2030. And all of this needs industry engagement to make sure people are aware of what INFOMAR can be used for and what it cannot be used for. And that needs to include developers, but also consultants working in the Irish wind sector, stakeholders, for example, the Underwater Archaeology Unit, and G&G survey contractors who are unfamiliar with local conditions and could get steer from INFOMAR, can use INFOMAR coverage to optimise the value of their own data, and also to consider the basis for INFOMAR and G&G survey collaboration in the future to maximise the value of data collected in the Irish offshore sector. Thank you for your time.